Hello and welcome to this third session of our series on government performance management. I'm absolutely delighted that you were able to join us. Now, it's clear that governments are complex, multi-layered organizations, and therefore their efficiency and effectiveness have many, many dimensions. But this complexity and this diversity obscures three key facts. First, there are few underlying causes, and we've already discussed two of them in our previous two sessions. First being that you have a situation of multiple principles with multiple objectives which are often conflicting, and as a result, the managers and the officers do not know what is really expected from them. They have fuzziness as far as their goals and objectives are concerned. And if, as I said, if you do not know which race you are running, you're not likely to win that race. The second problem is the not me syndrome, that government officials try to pass the buck on to someone else, and this passing of the buck or responsibility is yet another problem. Now, the second point we must note, though we have diversity, the causes are similar across nations. So you'll find that they manifest themselves in different ways, but at the bottom, the underlying causes are pretty much the same. And finally, we have discussed that countries have dealt with these causes using remarkably similar approaches. And therefore, you can find that effective governments tend to have certain common strategies for dealing with these problems. We call them the 9 habits of an effective government. Last time, we said that we will start with number 5, which is what gets measured, gets done. Let's get started. If you recall last time, I said that the competitive and comparative advantage of nations depends on 3 things, and that is implementation, implementation, and implementation. Indeed, the world can be divided into 2 groups. Those who are able to implement their policies and those who can't implement their policies. A group of countries where the gap between what they say and what they do is huge, and the other where the gap between what they promise and what they deliver is narrower. And as I said, the countries where the gap between rhetoric and reality is narrower tend to develop faster. Now, I also said that implementation is not rocket science. In fact, you do not need a degree, a specialized training in implementation. It's very, very simple. At the heart of implementation is follow-up. For many years, I was told that since you work in the Cabinet Secretary's office and Prime Minister's office, it's easy for you to say implementation is easy, but try doing it in other parts of the government. But those who have worked with Prime Ministers and Cabinet Secretaries know that not everything that the Prime Ministers say or the Cabinet Secretaries dictate gets done. But for sure, where we follow up on what has been said by the Prime Minister or the Cabinet Secretary gets done. So it's all about follow-up. In fact, it's about effective follow-up, and that's the whole point. The difference between follow-up and effective follow-up. Follow-up is another simple name for monitoring and evaluation. So it really depends on the quality of monitoring and evaluation, not the quantity of monitoring and evaluation. Let me share a true story. In 1991, when I joined the Government of India as Economic Advisor to the Government of India in the Department of Public Enterprises, my first day in office, I was given a set of documents like these. They're called Public Enterprise Survey. Now, these are only 2 of them, but there were 5 such massive volumes. They had all the information that you needed on India's public enterprises in the central government. And there are 250 from Atomic Energy Corporation to Handlooms and Handicrafts Corporation, so entire range of corporations. Now that was a mammoth big task. So my colleagues brought the very first day in office 5 volumes of what is called the Public Enterprise Survey. And if you're not careful, this could give you a slip disc. They were that heavy. So I asked Naturally, I was a little worried, and I said, do you have an executive summary of this document? They said, no, sir, this is very important, and we are required to present it to the Parliament in this format. I insisted. I said, but you must surely have a summary, or you can do a summary. Well, they said, not really, sir. This is a very important requirement, and we've been doing this way for a long time. So when I insisted a little bit more, one of my colleagues, rather junior colleague, came in and said, sir, the reason we do not summarize is if we were to summarize this document, they will start asking questions. And that means the Parliament will start asking questions. So the whole point was give them so much information that they do not know where to begin. And therefore, one has to make a distinction between information and the quality of information. Now, since then, whenever I get a lot of information, I know they're giving me the haystack and they expect me to find the needle. So in fact, more information does not mean more accountability or better measurement. So let's talk about monitoring and evaluation. The way people talk about monitoring and evaluation is as if they are the same thing. In fact, they're very, very different. And that's the first thing to know about monitoring and evaluation. To give you an example, if you take a flight from point A to point B, you as a customer, as a client, all you care is that it started on time, it reached on time, you had wonderful service throughout the journey, and the cost was very competitive. If you meet all these criteria, you as a client would judge or evaluate and say this was a good flight. But monitoring is different. You don't monitor the flight. In fact, it's the pilot who monitors the flight. The pilot, to get you from point A to B, has to monitor not only the headwinds, the tailwinds, the distribution of weight, the temperature inside, the temperature outside, the amount of fuel, and a host of parameters. Anyone who's peeked into the cockpit of a plane knows what it looks like. Just imagine if I, as a customer or a client who is great at evaluating the quality of journey, is made in charge of flying the plane from point A to point B. I'm not sure how long this will stay up in the air. So there are two very different things. I'm very good at evaluation, but I'm afraid I cannot monitor. That is the job of the pilots. Let me share 3 videos. They're from an ad in the television, but they're my favorite videos, and they explain the concept of monitoring better than anything. Basically, they're saying monitoring is a means towards an end, and if you do not have a clear end, a clear objective, then what's the point of monitoring?
David, you have one of the worst cavities I have ever seen. Okay, have a good day.
Aren't you gonna fix it?
Well, I'm not a dentist, I'm a dental monitor. I just tell you when you have a bad cavity.
That's bad. Lunch?
Oh, yes.
Where are you going?
Why monitor a problem if you don't fix it?
Hey, do something.
Oh, I'm not a security guard. I'm a security monitor. I only notify people if there's a robbery. There's a robbery.
Why monitor a problem if you don't fix it?
Yep, it's termites.
Oh, get rid of them.
Oh, no, I'm not an exterminator. I'm a pest monitor. I only let you know when there's a problem. There's a problem. All right, you guys take care. Bye.
Why monitor a problem if you don't fix it? That's
Indeed, why monitor if you can't fix it? Now, when it comes to evaluation, remember I said M&E stands for monitoring and evaluation. We've spoken a little bit about monitoring, and we'll revisit and talk much more later on. But let's go to evaluation. Now, evaluation is also not new in the government. Ever since the government was invented, government has been evaluating its performance. Initially, the way government evaluated its performance was by looking at the budget. Because when we started, it was considered that it's impossible to evaluate government because it was doing such wonderful things that they could not be evaluated. And the only way you could evaluate the government was by focusing on the budget. So if you spent the money, that is, if you utilized the entire budget, your performance was considered to be good, because it was assumed that the money went for good causes. Now, as the governments realized that wasn't the case, that money was being spent, but the problems were not being solved, then came the concept of performance budget. And in that, they added, in addition to financial expenditure, they added inputs and outputs and activities. And they called it performance budget. But then there was dissatisfaction with that. And then they said, well, it's not enough to monitor activities, inputs, and outputs. What we really need to do is monitor outcomes. And therefore, now we have outcome budgets. But now the problem with the outcome budgets is that I do not know, if you know, I'm willing to listen, I do not know any government that has successfully used outcome budgeting. And the reason is very simple. Outcomes are long-term. Child mortality takes several years for it to be affected. If you want to improve health or education, it cannot happen overnight. It happens over a long period of time. So if you're going to monitor using outcomes, you would be monitoring or evaluating when the horses have left the stable. The entire government would change. Not one, but two governments would have changed. Secretaries would have retired, and you would not be able to catch anybody for either good or bad performance. So therefore, outcomes, though they are fashionable, the academics and my colleagues have always said, well, it's a good idea. In theory, it sounds like a good idea, but in practice, it's very difficult. In addition to their long-term perspective, they're not short-term. The other problem is that there are too many variables that affect most of these outcomes. For instance, even child mortality. It's not simply about medicines. It's about food, nutrition, health, education, not only the health of the child, but also the health of the mother. So all these factors allow the officials to very easily say, well, it's not me. If the outcome hasn't come about, it wasn't us. It was someone else's fault. And so therefore, outcome budgets have, though they remain on paper, they've really never been successful. What is successful, and this is the emerging best practice, many countries are using what is called performance agreement. They're known by different names. Somewhere they're called the commitment for results, compromiso de resultados, contrat du plan, MOU, results framework document. So there are various names, but essentially it's a very simple concept. And it's called commitment for results. We'll use this CFR as a term which would signify the whole basket of these approaches, which are essentially the same. And we'll talk about the differences in these approaches. Now, the difference between the CFR, which is the most evolved form of evaluation, is, first of all, they're comprehensive. They cover everything. They not only cover input, activities, outputs, outcomes, financial, non-financial, static, dynamic. Every aspect of government department's performance is covered by them. So they are the most comprehensive way of looking at the government department. Before we move on, let me take this opportunity to explain why performance agreements or commitment for results are considered superior to previous approaches. The basic reason is that commitment for results overcome three major fatal flaws which afflict the previous approaches to performance evaluation of a government department. The first is that most government departments have a long list of objectives, but they are not prioritized. So I'm asked to do 15 things, and I go to my boss and I say, John, I have been able to do 12 out of the 15 things that you had asked me to do, but I'm afraid I could not achieve the targets for 3 things. How is my boss to evaluate my performance. I submit to you. If the boss likes me, he would say, well, that's good enough, and let's go and have a beer. But it's quite possible that those three things that I did not do are the key things that the department requires. I did all the dinky little stuff. I organized workshops, I wrote some papers, and I did some inspections, but I did not do the real stuff, the hard stuff, the stuff that really benefits the department. So therefore, the beauty or the performance lies in the eyes of the beholder. If you want to look at it and say, well, 12 out of 15 seems like a good number to achieve, you could put a positive spin. But if for some reason you don't like the person, you say, well, those three things really matter. And so this subjectivity is the bane of public sector. The subjective power that the bosses have over their subordinates discourages the subordinates and makes them feel that ultimately is going to be the subjective evaluation of my boss. Therefore, why bother? Just keep the boss happy. And that's a slippery slope. The same thing applies to indicators. Not only that your objectives are not properly prioritized, your indicators are also not prioritized. So some things you achieve quite easily, some things you don't achieve because they require a lot of effort. They need to be prioritized. So giving them weights, prioritizing, as we shall see later on in the series, is considered to be essential. If someone is not doing it, you can quickly come to a conclusion that you are not evaluating whatever else you are doing. You may be monitoring, you may be describing, but you are not evaluating. And evaluation means that you are able to prioritize what you are doing. The second or the third fatal flaw that most of the systems have, most of the governments, even in 2020, I'm surprised many governments succumb to this fatal flaw, is that they give you a single point target. If you work in the government, they'll tell you you have to build 700 kilometers of road. You go at the end of the year to your boss and say, sir, I was able to build 685 kilometers. You had asked me to build 700, but I was able to build 685 kilometers. How is my boss to judge me? Now I submit again that if the boss likes me, he'll say, Praja, this is close enough, let's go and have a beer. If my boss doesn't like me, he'll say, Praja, you're a nice man, but the problem is that you don't achieve targets. So again, my boss has this subjective hold on me. My performance lies in his eyes. Performance lies in the eyes of the beholder. So it could go either way. And this is a fatal flaw. This subjectivity is what gives bad name, and that's why in the name of evaluation, a lot of things are done. I don't want to use a name for those things, but they are close to murder. And we will see how we can overcome, and countries are doing it. There are methodologies which have overcome all these problems. The issue is, in 2020, in spite of the information age, there's so much social media, we still do not know what is the right way to evaluate a government department. It should be clear that performance measurement is not performance management, but performance measurement is a necessary condition for performance management. You cannot manage if you cannot measure. And so let me end where we started. What gets measured indeed gets done. But people do not know the rest of the story, and that's equally important. In fact, I would say it's more important. So let's go through the rest of this famous saying, what gets measured gets done. The next part is, if you don't measure results, you can't tell success from failure. Indeed, if you can't see success, you can't reward it. If you can't reward success, you are probably rewarding failure. If you can't see success, you can't learn from it. If you can't recognize failure, you can't correct it. And finally, and this is the most important one, if you can demonstrate results, you can win public support. Now, it's very important, mark the words, if you can demonstrate results, not that you can get results, because if we do nothing, something will happen. That's the way the world is. It doesn't mean that you caused it to happen. So you need to demonstrate that it was because of you that these things happen. Stock markets go up and down. It may have nothing to do with you. They were in any case perhaps going up when you arrived on the scene. So you can't be taking the credit. You could, but I'm afraid in 2020 people are much, much, much more clever. They get it. So if the economy is on the upswing and it's already increasing, and you say that you caused it to increase, I'm afraid people get it. So therefore, what is important is if you can demonstrate results, you can win it. So people and the governments that succeed are the ones which make a promise and they demonstrate that they can deliver those promises. Those are the governments which are considered effective, and they are the governments which are also considered as performing governments. Hope to see you next time, and we'll take it from here.